Once upon a time in a quiet Nigerian village called Obinogu, there lived a wealthy merchant named Okafor. He was a man of great ambition, always seeking rare and exotic treasures to display his status and wealth. His house was filled with objects from distant lands, golden goblets, ivory statues, and silken tapestries. Yet, his appetite for rare possessions was insatiable. One day, on a trading expedition to a distant town, Okafor stumbled upon a peculiar market. Among the stalls selling spices and fabrics stood an old man with a curious object, a beautifully ornate wall clock. It was carved from black ebony wood, its surface etched with intricate designs resembling ancient runes. The clock's golden numerals seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and its pendulum swung silently, as if it moved without resistance. Okafor was captivated. "How much for this clock?" he asked eagerly. The old man hesitated before replying. "This clock is not for everyone," he said in a low voice. "It does more than keep time. It binds those who own it. Many have tried to possess it, and none have prospered." Okafor, blinded by his greed and dismissive of the warning, insisted on buying the clock. The old man reluctantly sold it, murmuring, "You will soon learn that time is not always on your side." At first, the clock seemed harmless. It hung proudly on the wall in Okafor's grand living room, ticking with a rhythmic precision that filled the house. The clock quickly became the centerpiece of his home, drawing admiration from visitors. Its ebony frame glinted in the light, and its golden numerals seemed almost alive. Okafor felt a sense of pride whenever he gazed at it. However, things began to take a sinister turn within days of bringing the clock home. The first strange occurrence happened 3 nights after the clock was hung. At exactly midnight, the house fell eerily silent. The usual night sounds, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the wind, vanished. Instead, a faint whispering sound filled the air. At first, Okafor thought it was the wind. But as he listened closely, he realized the whispers were coming from inside his house. They were faint but unmistakable, as though a crowd of people were speaking in hushed tones, their voices overlapping. Worse still, they seemed to emanate from the clock. The merchant lit a lantern and approached the clock, but as he drew near, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Shaking his head, he convinced himself it was his imagination and went back to bed. The next morning, Okafor noticed something odd. The clock's hands, which he had set to the correct time, were running backward. He reset the clock, but by evening, it was ticking in reverse again. It was as if time itself was unraveling within his home. As the days passed, the strange occurrences grew more unsettling. The pendulum would sometimes swing erratically, speeding up or slowing down without reason. At other times, it would stop altogether, and the clock would fall eerily silent. One evening, while sitting in his living room, Okafor noticed shadows flickering on the walls. At first, he thought they were caused by the lantern's light, but the shapes didn't match any of the objects in the room. They moved independently, stretching and twisting like living things. As he watched, one shadow seemed to detach itself from the wall and dart across the room. Okafor jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. But when he looked again, the shadow was gone. It wasn't long before inanimate objects began to behave strangely. One night, Okafor heard a loud crash from the living room. Rushing to investigate, he found that a vase sitting on a shelf near the clock had fallen and shattered. The odd thing was that there was no breeze or disturbance that could have caused it. Another time, a book that had been lying flat on the table was found standing upright, its pages fluttering as if being turned by an invisible hand. As the clock's influence grew, Okafor began to experience vivid nightmares. He dreamt of dark figures with glowing eyes surrounding him, their voices echoing in a language he couldn't understand. In every dream, the clock was present, looming over him like a malevolent force. During the day, cold spots appeared throughout the house, especially near the clock. No matter how many fires okafor lit or how warm the weather was outside, the area around the clock was always icy cold. The final straw came one night when the clock struck 12. As the last chime echoed through the house, the clock's face began to glow. A faint, bluish light emanated from the golden numerals, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Okafor, trembling with fear, watched as the glow grew brighter. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time he could make out his name being spoken. Okafor. Okafor. The merchant tried to flee, but as he reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. The glow from the clock intensified, and for a moment, Okafor thought he saw faces swirling within the glass, faces twisted in anguish, their eyes pleading for release. These occurrences left Okafor a shadow of his former self. His pride and confidence were replaced by fear and paranoia. Yet, despite all this, he refused to part with the clock, convinced that he could control whatever force resided within it. Unbeknownst to him, the clock was only growing stronger, feeding on his fear and the energy of his home. It was no longer just a timepiece, it had become a living entity, and its true power was yet to be revealed. Terrified by the strange occurrences that plagued his home, Okafor sought help. His once thriving household was now a desolate place. Visitors stopped coming, his workers avoided his home, and he was left alone with the relentless ticking of the cursed clock. Desperate to understand what was happening, he turned to Mama Ikin, the oldest and wisest elder in the village. Mama Ikin lived on the outskirts of Obinogu in a small hut surrounded by sacred herbs and ancient symbols. She was known to have a deep connection to the spiritual realm and an understanding of things beyond the physical world. When Okafor arrived, she was tending to her fire, chanting softly under her breath. As Okafor described the strange occurrences, Mama Ikin listened intently, her face growing graver with each word. When he finished, she remained silent for a long moment before speaking. "That clock you brought into your home is not an ordinary object," she said. "It carries a dark history. It was created long ago by a powerful sorcerer who sought to manipulate time and cheat death. He infused the clock with dark magic, using the souls of the innocent to fuel his work. The runes carved into its frame are ancient spells, bindings for the spirits he captured." Okafor's heart sank as she continued. The sorcerer was eventually defeated by a group of brave warriors and a priestess who sealed the clock, trapping the sorcerer's essence and the spirits he enslaved inside it. The clock was hidden away, meant never to be disturbed. But somehow, it found its way into the world again, and now it has chosen you. Okafor's voice trembled. "What do you mean it has chosen me?" Mama Ikin fixed him with a piercing gaze. "The clock feeds on the energy of those who possess it. It draws life from your fear, your greed, and your weakness. The more you cling to it, the stronger its hold becomes. It will drain you, little by little, until there is nothing left but a shadow of yourself. And then, it will take you, just as it has taken others before you." Okafor's hands shook as he asked, "Is there no way to destroy it?" Mama Ikin sighed. "Destroying the clock would release the spirits trapped within. They are angry, tormented souls who know only pain and suffering. If you break the clock, their wrath will be unleashed upon you and the entire village. The sorcerer's essence may even return, seeking revenge on the living. The clock is a prison, and opening it would unleash horrors beyond imagination." Okafor felt a chill run down his spine. "Then what can I do?" "The clock must be returned to its place of origin," Mama Ikin said. "It must be taken far from the village, to a sacred place where the spirits can be pacified and the sorcerer's essence can be contained. But be warned, this will not be easy. The clock does not wish to live. It will fight you, using your deepest fears against you. And even if you succeed, you may not survive the journey." Okafor left Mama Ikin's heart filled with dread. The elder had given him a choice, to confront the clock and attempt to return it or to allow its curse to consume him entirely. That night, as he sat in his darkened home, the clock seemed more alive than ever. Its ticking was louder, almost deafening, and the whispers had grown into a chorus of voices, chanting in an unholy language. The pendulum swung erratically, casting flickering shadows across the room. Okafor knew that the clock was aware of his intentions. It would not let him go easily. Okafor returned to Mama Ikin the next day, begging for another solution. "Is there no way to free myself without risking my life?" he pleaded. Mama Ikin frowned. "There is one way, but it comes at a great cost. You could transfer the clock's curse to another. Offer it to someone willing, or foolish enough, to take it, and the clock will shift its focus to them. But such a choice is a dark one. It would mean condemning another soul to your fate." Okafor was horrified by the idea but couldn't shake the temptation. The whispers in his home grew louder that night, and for the first time, they offered him a choice: give us another, and you will be free. Okafor was faced with an impossible decision. Should he risk his life to rid the village of the cursed clock, or should he save himself by dooming another? As the days passed, the curse tightened its grip on him. His health deteriorated, his once bright eyes grew dull, and the whispers haunted him relentlessly. The clock had claimed many lives before his, and now, it seemed determined to add his name to its dark legacy. Whether Okafor chose to confront the clock or betray another soul, one thing was certain: the clock's curse was a reminder that greed and arrogance could invite forces far beyond human control. The cursed clock, now fully attuned to its owner, began to reveal the full extent of its power. By this time, Okafor's life had become a nightmare. The whispers that once haunted the midnight hours now echoed throughout the day, becoming louder and more relentless. His once grand home felt suffocating, the air heavy with an unseen presence. It was clear that the clock, no longer content with tormenting him, was preparing to consume him entirely. One night, as the clock struck 12, the house descended into chaos. The walls trembled as if in protest, and the golden numerals on the clock's face began to glow with an unholy light. The pendulum, which had been swinging steadily moments before, stopped mid-motion, and the ticking ceased altogether. In the oppressive silence that followed, Okafor heard a low growl emanating from the clock. The sound grew louder and more guttural until it seemed to fill the entire house. Then, the clock's hands began to spin wildly, faster and faster, as if trying to tear through time itself. Suddenly, the glass covering the clock's face shattered, and from within the clock emerged a dense, black mist. The mist writhed and twisted, forming shadowy figures with glowing red eyes. These figures were the trapped souls, bound by the sorcerer's curse, and they had been awakened by the clock's growing power. The shadowy figures moved toward Okafor, their voices a cacophony of anger and sorrow. "You were warned," they hissed. "Yet you brought us here. Now, you will pay for your greed." The shadows surrounded Okafor, their cold, spectral hands reaching for him. He tried to run, but the air grew thick, making it impossible to move. His body felt paralyzed, his limbs heavy as though they were being restrained by invisible chains. The shadows began to pull him closer to the clock, their grip tightening with every passing moment. Okafor's screams echoed through the house, but outside, the village lay in silence. It was as if the clock had created a barrier, isolating its victim from the world. The clock's wrath extended beyond its immediate surroundings. Objects in the house began to animate, as if possessed by the same dark energy. Furniture moved on its own, chairs scraping across the floor and tables tipping over. Mirrors cracked, their shattered fragments reflecting distorted images of the shadowy figures. The house itself seemed alive. The walls pulsed like a living creature, and the floorboards groaned under an unseen weight. Candles flickered violently, their flames casting monstrous shadows that danced across the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and frost began to form on the windows and walls. In a moment of desperation, Okafor remembered Mama Ikin's warning. he realized that the clock's power fed on his fear and despair. Summoning what little courage he had left, he faced the clock directly. "You will not take me," he shouted, his voice trembling but resolute. The clock responded with a deafening roar, the shadowy figures swirling more violently around him. The golden numerals on the clock's face began to melt, dripping like molten gold, and the runes etched into its ebony frame glowed with an intense, fiery light. The voices of the trapped souls grew louder, their cries of anguish merging into a single, ear-piercing scream. The clock's pendulum resumed its motion, swinging faster and faster, as though counting down to an inevitable doom. At the peak of the chaos, the clock's face opened like a portal, revealing a swirling void of darkness. The shadows dragged Okafor toward it, their icy hands relentless. As he was pulled closer, the whispers in the air grew clearer, repeating a chilling phrase. "Time is up." With one final scream, Okafor was pulled into the void, disappearing entirely. The clock's pendulum stopped, and the house fell silent. The frost on the walls melted, the furniture returned to its place, and the air grew still. When the villagers entered the house the next morning, they found it empty. Okafor was gone, and the only thing left was the cursed wall clock, hanging silently on the wall. Its face was unbroken, its numerals intact, and its pendulum swinging steadily once more, as though nothing had happened. The villagers, now convinced of the clock's malevolence, carried it deep into the forest. They buried it under the roots of an ancient Iroko tree, performing rituals and prayers to seal its power. But even now, it is said that on quiet nights, if you pass near the Iroko tree, you can hear the faint ticking of the clock. Some believe it is counting down to the day when it will awaken again, searching for another unsuspecting soul to claim. And so, the cursed war clock remains a chilling reminder of the dangers of greed, arrogance, and meddling with forces beyond human comprehension.